Hello everybody, and it's Monday again, which means another episode of Monday Rules. And first up, let's talk about the honorable mentions for last week's Fubuki Gun Challenge. First up, we have Shadow Wolf with 58,828 damage, then Mari X Gazette at 58,023 damage, followed by Husky Dog 44, 54k, and then there's Camney Sibo 44,709 damage, and then finally Happy Milk 336 at 40,996 damage. And the winner for last week's Fubuki Gun Challenge is someone a lot of you might be familiar with, as he has won some Monday Rules challenges before. And that is Lord Zath in a Fubuki. Now, Lord Zath has set his Fubuki up for stealth firing, which when you equip a concealment module plus the captain skills plus the concealment camouflage and you get advanced firing training and everything, the Fubuki becomes a quite competent stealth firing ship. One of the things that it allows the Fubuki to do is that as long as it stays outside of essentially 9-kilometer range, it is invisible while it fires its guns. So this Iowa over here is getting hit by Fubuki shells, but it can't see where the Fubuki is at all, and therefore not really able to fire any return salvos. One of the good things about this particular setup in the Fubuki is that, one, because of advanced firing training, you have quite good range on your guns, and two, well, you're invisible. So it allows you to also be a very, very good cap prevention ship. If you play the Fubuki purely as a torpedo ship, yes, your torpedoes are really good, but when you really need potentially some gun performance, the range is not that great, and the buffer between your firing and detection range is not that big. But if you're able to play a Fubuki in sort of this hybrid gun and torpedo setup, you should still be able to get the best of both worlds. Now, Lord Zath, obviously, for the sake of the challenge, I believe, just didn't use any torpedoes for fear of taking too much damage away from his guns. But if you were playing this normally, you should be able to play this hybrid role, where you use these 15-kilometer torpedoes that the Fubuki has. And when the torpedoes are on reload, you go over to your guns and you start using your guns to deal additional damage. Now, the Japanese destroyers, starting around probably with the Hatsuharu, but most particularly starting with the Fubuki and beyond, actually have pretty decent guns. And a lot of times, there are a lot of people out there who don't really use their guns, even when the situation allows for them to use it. Now, one of the reasons why the Japanese destroyers, I think, also make decent hybrid boats these days is that with their high concealment, their high stealth, if there's another destroyer within their range, they should be able to spot that destroyer first, as long as the Japanese destroyer actually maintains, a full stealth build. So because of that, the Japanese destroyer should, in theory, be able to maintain that awareness of whether or not it's going to actually get spotted by something closer to it when it fires its guns. To theory craft this idea a little bit further, what you could do with a hybrid gun and torpedo Japanese destroyer is get within a good range for torpedoes, so maybe let's say 6.5 kilometers. Lead your torpedoes behind the prediction indicator, assuming that the enemy ship is at full speed. And then what you do is you start to turn away and start to exfil. And what's going to happen is that as you get closer to the Invisifire range, so as you get closer to 9 kilometers, you could open up with your guns. And what's going to happen is you should pop up right before you go invisible. Now, if you do that, the enemy battleships, if they're paying attention, should see you pop up, realize that you're a Japanese destroyer, and start turning away. And if they do that, then they should turn straight into your torpedoes. At least, that's a theory. I mean, that's what theory crafting's for. But that's my guess. The other good thing, of course, is as long as you're able to stay near a cap as a hybrid Japanese destroyer, you can continuously to reset a cap. So, Chronically Chronic in the enemy Iowa here is trying to cap C after wiping out the cruisers on the cap. And what Lord Zath is going to do is pretty much stay outside of his detection range and drop shells, and then constantly reset the Iowa to the point where the Iowa couldn't cap. And let's be honest about this, right? Battleships hate things that they cannot see shooting at them and setting them on fire, which The Fubuki, even though it doesn't have the world's greatest fire chance, as you can see, Lord Zath has fired quite a few shells and not really gotten many fires, it is still incredibly annoying as a battleship to be hit by something that you just cannot retaliate against. Had Lord Zath actually used torpedoes, I think Chronic would have been even more screwed. But regardless, I mean, in a situation like this, the battleship can't cap, so he's going to get off. And during this period of time, Lord Zath collects 10 base defended ribbons, which is pretty nice. And also, most importantly, he's able to keep C from falling into enemy hands. And as a destroyer, sometimes that's all you really need to do is defend your cap. Just don't give it to the enemy team. And as long as you don't give it to the enemy team, they're not going to be gaining points from it. One thing that I should point out that I sort of forgot to do a little bit earlier is that while I'm saying that the Fubuki works as a hybrid ship, unlike the pure gunboats in terms of the Russian line or even the gunboats on the US line, the Fubuki is going to be using her guns as still sort of like a secondary option for damage. Her torpedoes are obviously still going to be her main weapons. I mean, the Japanese torpedoes are lethal for good reason, but the guns on the Japanese destroyers are no slouch at all. I mean, if you watch the engagements that Lord Zath has been having with the Iowas, he's been doing decent damage salvos, so especially in this case, with the Iowa giving him a nice easy broadside to shoot at and him firing HE into the superstructure, we're talking 1,500, 2,000 damage per salvo, plus fires, which is actually quite a substantial amount of damage. And I think that is something that Japanese destroyer captains, especially when you get up to the higher tiers, you should really start thinking about. What if you can do torpedo and gun damage, right? Because while the torpedoes are the main weapons, once you fire them, what do you do for the next minute and a half, 2 minutes or so? Well, if you can use your guns to layer additional damage and help your team more that way, that's a good thing. There's one thing, of course, that also needs to be sort of addressed, which is what's going to happen when radar does make it into the game. And what I think is going to happen is that there might be this sort of shift in the way that the Japanese meta for the destroyers is played. Now, you're not going to be able to really sneak into 6-kilometer range, fire all the high damage torpedoes. So what you might have to do is go for a little bit more range. So maybe, let's say, fire torpedoes at 9 kilometers or something like that, and then start backing out and start lobbing shells as you are running away. And as a destroyer, if you're able to retreat and fire and dodge, it's going to make a reasonably hard target for enemies to shoot at. So I don't know, that's something to think about as well, because things are going to change when that thing is implemented, although do keep in mind that radar is still relatively going to be a short duration thing. Alright, so back to the battle quickly, and the enemy Pensacola and their Iowa are now pushing onto the cap again. Now, what Lord Zath does is fires his guns at the Pensacola to prevent the Pensacola from really gaining any cap points. Eventually, the enemy does manage to cap C, but by the time they cap it, the advantage still lies very, very firmly with Lord Zath's team, as they have the advantage both in terms of points and also by that time they're ahead in ships as well, because Pensacola gets nuked. The Iowa on their team that went along with the Pensacola does actually cap the base out, but again, once he comes out, Lord Zath is just going to keep dropping HE on him over and over and over again. And the poor Iowa really, as long as Lord Zath stayed out of 9 kilometers and he had no other support from destroyers or anything like that, couldn't see him. I mean, he futilely shoots back at Lord Zath, but that's all he manages to do while Lord Zath drops shell after shell after shell onto him. What was even more amusing about this particular engagement was that the enemy Iowa kept his broadside to Lord Zath's team, and he continues to point his bow in Lord Zath's direction. And when I saw that, I thought about it and I thought, that makes sense, because what he's thinking is that if there's a Japanese destroyer there, aka the Fubuki, I gotta keep pointing my bow at him, because if he's got torpedoes on the way, I don't want to be offering a broadside for those torpedoes to hit. And so this Iowa sits there, broadside on to Lord Zath's fleet, taking citadel hits from his team, while pointing bow on at a destroyer that isn't using his torpedoes at all. But the psychology is there not to turn. So that's another thing. If you're playing, let's say, a Fubuki, a Kagero, a Shimakaze, and you've got torpedoes in the water or something else, if you can predict what the enemy ship is going to do psychologically, then the hilarity could be real, because you could in essence lock them down into like one position and they won't move from that position thinking that they're going to be under threat. So in this case, because the eye was already bow on, he's going to stay bow on and thereby exposing his broadside. Had this Iowa been side on to Lord Zath and taken fire from this destroyer, he might have actually turned bow in, and thereby turning, and if you can predict that turn, you might be able to land some torpedoes. Just remember that while you're playing a Japanese destroyer, especially when you get to the higher tiers, your guns are a weapon. You're not defenseless. It's not like once you use your torpedoes, you've got nothing else. Your guns are a viable weapon, and they can be used to your advantage. Anyhow, Lord Zath's team does eventually manage to cap out, even though they only had one cap, but it was enough as they had such a substantial points lead. Alright, so let's take a look at how Lord Zath did in this battle with only his guns. And so Lord Zath in that battle manages to get 123,237 credits, which actually isn't a lot of credits, which I'm a little surprised at that number. 3,048 experience with the premium, 153 free experience, did 78,302 damage on 208 hits and 4 fires, managed to defend base 15 times, and assisted in 1 base capture. And to confirm the damage, there's 59,154 damage from the HE hits, only 19,000 fires. I think had RNG favored Lord Zath a little bit more, he would have gotten a bit more damage in terms of fires. Anyways, folks, there's no Monday Rules Challenge for this week. I should have another one for you guys challenge-wise next week. So have a good week, and I'm looking forward to talking to all of you again soon. Take care.